Coming up with the NBA Finals approaching game number 3, Doug and I reflect on the question, is there any right model to win a championship? And at the very least, do the Brooklyn Nets have the pieces to build a version of their own? We break that all down right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports needs. DraftKings, FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, and let you know today's episode is going to be brought to you by Rock Auto. It's amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. RockAuto.com. Tell them Locked On sent you. Dougster, before we dive in on the conversation, the final countdown, man. You are gearing up and shipping out. You're like a longshoreman just coming in for one sweet swift of the shoreline.
Oh, yeah. Promised myself never to move back to Mexico in the summer. Going to move back to Mexico in the summer. It's all right. I'm going to burn off. I've already thought to myself that 95 degree with humidity for a few months is going to be what takes off the old extra LBs. So that's that's the story I've been telling myself. I got a whole narrative behind it. Just going to sit in my own swelter and just slowly shave. You'll see by October. We'll do it before and after when we hit October. See how this guy has just sweated himself right off the edge of the earth. So yeah, looking forward to it. Getting a little crazy here as we gear up for it, but luckily we're in the off season. Plenty to talk about. Obviously, I think we got a good one here too, man, with some of this stuff. Like, I think these finals are really, even though the last game was a blowout, I think these finals are really interesting for just the NBA landscape writ large.
Yeah, I was going to say, speaking of guys sweating it off, the NBA Finals are in full swing here. Game 3 approaching. 2 blowouts. Nice narrative around the NBA playoffs. It doesn't seem like they necessarily want to play tight games. They want to go teeter-totter.
Well, can I
You can just push back in here, and yeah, go ahead.
I'll push back on that. I don't consider that first game a blowout. I know I got away from it at the end, but like they just went on such an epic run that game was kind of close for most of it, and then. Well, actually, it wasn't close. The Warriors were killing them. And then
let's reframe it this way: some imbalanced games throughout the playoffs, right? Where regardless of final scoreline, it seems like there are these big swings, and the NBA can be predicated on that a little bit. But there have been some epic runs from teams in the playoffs, including the Celtics in that first game there, that ultimately led to a bit of a blowout. But to your point, it led us to this question. When you and I have been talking about this kind of in the background of the podcast all off season, because there's so many curiosities that we have around the roster. What are the Nets maybe going to do? What do they need to do? And the need question is what spurs on this conversation. As you see, if you're watching on YouTube, a tale of two rosters, because the two teams in the finals have done it in two very different ways, which begets this idea of, is there any real model that you could put down in front of an NBA team and say, oh, that's how we do it. Let's build towards that, because it seems like it's deconstructing before our eyes.
Okay, so one of the reasons where this conversation stemmed from a little bit was we had sent out a tweet, or I sent out a tweet during the game 1 that was just basically referring to how the Warriors, just to give a little background, like where we kind of came up, where we started talking about this, was the Warriors essentially played two non-shooters together in Draymond and Kevon Looney in an era where, one, we've seen like what that happened with the Nets and how it can go bad, but in an era where like most teams, that's just a death knell. Like we saw the exact opposite happen with the Mavericks, like go 5 out, everyone be able to shoot. Even like the Suns, they're going to have 4 shooters on the team all the time. And then you have Ayton, who's an interior presence. Like a lot of these teams, really, to get this far, to have 2 non-shooters on your roster feels crazy. So basically where it stemmed from was just saying, we have an example here of a team where when they play this 5 together, Curry, Clay, Wiggins, Draymond, Looney, 2 of those guys cannot shoot. Like Draymond just doesn't shoot. Right. And the Kevon Looney can just basically shoot around the basket. And that team is just blowing people out of the water. So that lineup's been blowing people out of the water, posed this on Twitter, got a lot of pushback from, well, no one has Steph and Clay. Okay, just real quick, I get it. Don't believe me.
Everybody has a LeBron. We understand. Not every team has some of the prerequisites.
Well, okay. The first prerequisite you need to have basically a top 10 player in the NBA. So you have to start there. Every team, basically, to get this far, you have to have a top 10 player in the league, or a guy that's at least going to play in these moments, a la Jimmy Butler, like a top 10 player in the league.
Yeah.
Like you need to have that to start. After that, though, I would say the construction around these teams is all different. I couldn't believe how many people would just like give up around like, yeah, the Warriors, they run around so much. What, other teams can't run around? It's like, I don't get it. So anyway, do you agree with that premise though, that at least to start, that
all like legs are created the same?
Well, no, not that, but like that there's no right way to do it. Like we see these two completely conflicting teams. They both made the finals in their own way. And the part where now everyone wants to say that you need a certain kind of team to win the championship. Once you have a top 10, once you have a top 10 player or two, right? Like on your team. After that, there's all different, as far as I can tell, there's all different sort of roadmaps to be able to walk down. And like, it's crazy to me that there was pushback on that.
Well, and it's funny because I'll just slightly off mention a team that we talked about a little bit during the course of the playoffs in the Grizzlies with Morant, and that idea of look how successful they were even when Morant was off the court. But to your point about here's a guy that we think is going to be one of the better players in the league going forward, and I that almost spoke to what we're discussing here in a lot of ways. What is everybody else capable of doing? What roles do they fill? Even that version of a team is still quality, and I think that that's the difference here. The Golden State Warriors, okay. Curry is the guy, and you have Thompson coming off of injury. You still have Draymond Green. You have other talented players, but you do have that one piece. But everything else collectively makes for some version of competitive basketball. And I think maybe that's what this tweak is here. It's no longer about, well, your superstar player has to step up and take over games. They're going to, and that ends up being how you end up winning series or getting deeper in playoffs or winning championships, maybe ultimately. But the idea has to be that the other role players off of this can still succeed, even if your all-star caliber superstar talent is not giving you 40-plus performances on every single night, even if he's not doing the Herculean lifts. That's the shift to me. And that's why, yes, this version of Golden State, they're in the finals. Can you flip this roster and have it be something totally different next year and still be successful? Yes, you can. I don't think you'd be able to say that the same way. 5 to 7 years ago, you would not look at the landscape of the NBA and think, oh yeah, some of your parts, because that's almost definitively what everyone tried to get away from, starting with the LeBron down to Miami.
Well, right, because 5 to 7 years ago, also you were trying to beat the Warriors, who were just like a perfectly, right. Who were a perfectly built team that was just like that played this totally new style of basketball and like looked unbeatable. And then they get KD and they're basically completely unbeatable. Or you got to beat either them or you got to beat peak LeBron. Like that's going to be tough. But we're out of that. But we're out of that era now, though. Like is what I'm saying. We're getting out of that era.
Yeah. So is that as much of a catalyst for the way things are being constructed now? There is no longer this, we got to take down the Warriors in this iteration. So how do you beat them? Surround your superstar. You need a lot of shooters. Now the NBA is still predicated on that, but once that version of your enemy is removed, suddenly you need not be necessarily as high firepowered as you once thought you had to be to take down Team X.
And we're seeing that play out in the championship now, in the finals now. And there's if you're looking on YouTube, it says the non-shooting Warriors. This is referring to the two guys in the line that don't shoot. Now look, the way you make up for that is to have generational shooters around it. But what I'm saying is that my point is yes, that is the case. It's like, hey, when you have Steph and Clay, you don't need to surround them with a bunch more shooting. Like you can actually get players that complement the other things that they can't do, like defend and like be big and things like that. And so the Warriors have kind of figured this out. I think they're working the best. And the end part of this tweet had been do the best with your best, right? It's like do the best and put around the best pieces that you can fit around what your guys already do well. And like I think that has been kind of lost in this landscape now, which is where everyone seems to think again that you need to do it this one correct way in order to be able to really compete. But because there's no really truly dominant team like there was with this, with the peak Warriors, or one truly dominant player like there was with LeBron, like now
you're not preparing for this one thing, the end game.
Because most frankly, and I want to get to the Celtics because there's another version of this with the Celtics. It's different, and there was no point in kind of combining them. Mm-hmm. But for a lot of those years, frankly, if you weren't LeBron and you weren't the Warriors, a lot of teams just punted. They didn't even there's like, you know what, we can't really do this. Not everybody. The Rockets kind of went for it for a couple seasons, almost got there. We're almost able to sort of reconstruct the things that gave the Warriors time. But a lot of the other teams just saw it and were like, you know what, dude, we just got to wait for we got to wait a few years on this because we're not gonna be able to compete with it. That's not the case anymore. Like that is not the case. We've seen it already play out this year. And again, we can get into it in a second, but like Boston did something They did something similar, but in a totally different way. I guess that's
on the back end of this episode, we'll talk about how this ties into the Brooklyn Nets, what version of their team is the best version of this, and to your point about competitive balance around the league and why this is probably a good thing overall. So I want to make sure that's in the old hip pocket here, and we'll dive in on Boston in a second.
All right. Yeah, in a second we'll talk about Boston because I think this is an interesting case study too. But first, you got to go over to Prize Picks. NBA fans, we got a few games left. I said Warriors in 5. That one, I'm still going to stick with that. Maybe it's getting a little closer though. I felt really good about it at halftime of the first game. Anyway, Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. We have a few more games where you can get in some of these Prize Pick entries. They're so easy to use. You pick 2 to 5 players. You just go over under on their projections. You can win up to 10x on any entry. And it's just you versus the projected numbers. The over-unders, you're not putting in lineups. You're not going against all those sharks in the water that are putting in, all these different salaried lineups, and you're trying to mix and match every little piece. Don't worry about it. Just go to Prize Picks. Go against the numbers. It is very easy. Up to 60 seconds. That's all it takes to put in an entry. Super fast and safe withdrawals as well. And you can pick all the stats, points, rebounds, steals, block shots, assists, all these ones. Pile it together with some MLB action, maybe throw some MMA in the weekends. You got it all covered for you on Prize Picks. You can mix and match those sports entries. Prize Picks has an exclusive no-brainer of an offer for our users. You get $50 for free if a player in your first Prize Picks entry scores a single point, but you have to use the promo code NBA. That's an exclusive offer just for Locked On fans. Sign up today. Use the code NBA for $50 for free if a player in your first Prize Pick entry scores a single point. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy.
Okay, so the way that I think it's interesting, we didn't touch on Brooklyn at all yet, but the funny part about teeing it up for Boston here is that it's a conversation we've had around Brooklyn. Boy, what do they really need? A pure point guard, a guy that can be the facilitator, on ball, run the offense, and yet Boston may be presenting another version of success in the NBA where maybe that mechanic need not exist to be in the finals and be in a 1-1, and looking to possibly win a championship.
Yeah, look, they have a point guard, a de facto point guard in Marcus Smart. Like, he's labeled as a point guard. He guards the opposing offense's point guard. Like, I guess that's as close as they're going to get to a point guard. No one going into the season or even now would call him like a top, definitely not an offense point guard. No. They had a guy that you maybe would have thought was like that, a Dennis Schroeder on the roster. They just traded him away because he didn't fit at all to what they were doing. And so they're basically left with no real point guard in the team. Now, what they did, the calculation, sort of different than the Warriors calculation. The Warriors calculation was, hey, we'll have 2 great shooters, 1 pretty good shooter in Wiggins, and then we'll bring Poole off the bench for some more offense, and then we'll just have these like other defenders that are out there. Boston was like, hey, everyone's just going to defend, and we'll just make up for the fact that we're not that great at dribbling, with the fact that we're going to make it impossible for you to dribble, right? Like, and that calculation has worked. Like, they're in the finals again without really a classic point guard distributor on their offense. They've said, we have other guys in Tatum and Jaylen Brown and Marcus Smart to some degree that are good enough on offense on their own that they can all sort of like combine to be offensive facilitators in what we're trying to run on offense. Yeah. And then they have, a guy like Al Horford that can stretch the floor. But if you look at that team, you're not like, hey, who's the point guard? Yes, it's Marcus Smart, but he's not in that discussion among that group. So it's just very interesting. They said it's going to be all defense. And we have a top, he's playing like top 5-7 player in Tatum at worst right now, right? And so, because again, they fill that prerequisite because they have Tatum. So after that, it's just like, hey, let's put together around, other things that our other pieces line up really well with, which is play lockdown defense and make it completely impossible for you to get points. And we're going to do it that way. It's just almost the exact opposite of what the Warriors do with this constant motion, make you run around. But look, they're both in the finals together. Yeah. And they did it completely differently. Right. Like, and I think that's what actually Nets fans need to start hanging their hat on here a little bit.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's funny because and maybe that is now, again, whatever the final score was, but these surges, these ebbs and flows that we've seen so far in the finals is really predicated on the 2 styles of these teams. The strongest defense, the best rated defense in the NBA coming into these finals. I think they went back and they showed, Udoka, when he started to make the shift for the Celtics, they were the 5th best rated defense. They got to number 1. They were an atrocious offensive team, and they got themselves to be respectable. And that's how they moved the tide on the back half of their season. But then inside of a series like this, okay, if you can't dribble, if you have a lot of non-dribblers, and we understand the way we're classifying NBA players being non-dribblers, but if you lack some of that on Boston's side of it, you hang your hat on defense, but you are going to run into stretches where unfortunately, even the best defense going up against some of the best shooters in the game is going to fall down for you. Likewise, for the Golden State Warriors, yeah, we're going to run you ragged. We're predicated on energy and a lot of motion, and a really good defense can shut you down. The interesting thing, I think, from Boston's perspective, to add on to, it's, lacking a true pure point guard, and then strength, I think, is a part of these models. Being a team that has enough physicality to stand up against some of the better teams. And we saw this in the series against the Brooklyn Nets. Whatever version Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving brought to the table, ultimately what it came down to is, hey, even if we are fouling you, even if we're not succeeding and you're still getting buckets, we can also have a cumulative effect of wearing you down. That's a part of the Boston model in my mind too. Is it's the kind of thing where you go at the end of the game, all right, 3, 4, 5 more of these, like that, I think wears on a team, especially one like Golden State that is predicated so heavily on the high firepower scoring.
Yeah, totally. And again, it's totally different. They're using size, they're using strength, they're using the ability to switch basically 1 through 5, when depending on what lineups they're playing with. They have all these other built-in advantages that make up for this other lack of thing that they, just agreed that they weren't going to be able to have. The offense can still generate baskets. You want to hear a crazy stat though? I was actually shocked when I was doing a little research for this episode just about some of these lineups. One was one kind of fits the eye test, the Curry, Clay, Draymond, Wiggins, Looney lineup through the playoffs, 134 minutes, and basically has just stomped other people. 123 offensive rating, 102 defensive rating. That's just, plus 20.9. They're just killing teams when those 5 play together. 134 minutes, because remember, they kind of made the shift with Looney, but I did a 4-man lineup for the Celtics. So because I was like, hey, they have a core 4 guys, and like Robert Williams has been a little injured. They bring in Grant Williams. So I wanted to just do the core 4 of these guys. Mm-hmm. This core 4 of Smart, Tatum, Brown, and Horford has gotten killed. I don't know how they're in the finals.
Really?
They have a negative net rating of negative 3.2 for it's different on 2 sites. PvP stats and NBA stats both have it a little differently. So it's making me think that one of them hasn't counted one of the games. It doesn't matter. They're both negative. One's negative 3.2, one's negative 4.4. That's shocking. This is by the way, this lineup, that group of 4 has played the most playoff minutes of any 4 group players together in this playoffs, and has been a negative, and they're tied 1 for 1 in the finals. That is crazy. It's to the point where it's how did they even do it? Some of it has to do with game 7s. Some of it has to do with some crazy blowouts in some of these series where they just ended up losing by a lot more than they won the other games. But to have your 4 players that have played the most playoff minutes together be negative for the entire playoffs and be tied in the finals is completely crazy, to the point where I actually can't even believe it happened.
Well, this is not the only reason why, but when you look over the course of the playoffs, and to Boston's credit, to Jason Tatum's credit, he's done a very good job bouncing back from bad games, right? He can have somewhat all-time terrible shooting performances and then turn around and drop 40, which you need. So, if you said that Kevin Durant was going to give you these kind of, pendulum swing performances from one game to the other, you'd probably say, hey, well, the ratings for those best 4-man lineups are going to end up falling somewhere in the middle, especially when you throw in a guy like Marcus Smart. We know that he's streaky from the outside, not entirely a shooter either. But even with that, I'm throwing in as hey, they're a little more volatile as an offensive team than most would probably be from a 4-man perspective. It's still shocking that you can make it through a round in the playoffs, maybe even 2 rounds. But the idea, to your point, of being tied up in the finals when you see that stat is somewhat alarming.
Yeah,
it's impressive, but
the most minutes together in the whole playoffs, and they had a negative net rating. It's that I can't imagine any other team that's ever gotten this far has been able to survive that somehow, because. Yeah. It just means, well, basically what it's meant is every one of their other combinations have been amazing. Every time they bring in guys like Grant Williams and he goes off, they gotten crazy good Peyton Pritchard minutes at times. They had these other, Derek White has had his streaks where he's been able to kind of carry them weirdly. So they've had everything else has just worked out, but that one core 4 has just not been. So I just thought it was an interesting stat.
One last quick thing, because in a second we're going to talk about the Brooklyn Nets and what their roster looks like and what is the amalgamation of maybe these 2 versions of teams that they could produce for themselves. Draymond Green comes out of game number 2, he's doing his thing. Just where do you stand on Draymond Green? Maybe at this point of his career, I guess, because to your point, he's done shooting the ball. He does a lot of good things for you. He clearly he understands what he was doing. I looked at it as, shame on you, Boston, for letting him irritate you in a lot of ways, because you know what it is coming in. And Boston is a relatively young team, though they do have playoff experience. Tatum has playoff experience, but Like, that's how I looked at it. And I very rarely am one who likes the non-basketball related stuff. In this instance, I was like, you know what? You got a ton of tape on Draymond Green doing things like this and other players getting bothered by it and costing them games in series. Shame on you for letting it happen.
Yeah, like the scouting report on this part of his game is like on the math's undefeated here. I don't know how, but he still is able to do it. He's still able to get under your skin and kind of toe the line. And at times he's taken it too far and he's cost them. I mean, he cost him a series that the year he got suspended, basically. Like, so it can cost you because he takes it right to the line and sometimes you cross it and if they lose him, it's kind of over. But man, I do find it a little bit impossible at times because it's just like, so it's almost like a caricature that I don't kind of get into that. I do think that if he was on the Nets, he'd probably be like they would have already hung the jersey in the rafters. Cause it's like, you would just absolutely love it if it's on your team. But yeah, I just kind of where I stand from him. You just can't fall for it. And especially at home where you just know he's going to just try to needle you to death. And it's going to be very unbasketball related for long stretches. And year whatever for him, it still works.
A classic My Pet Monster scenario. Coming up here in a second, we're going to take a look at the Brooklyn Nets, some of their non-shooters, and whether or not they can construct a successful deep playoff team as currently constituted. Before we do, though, friends, I'm going to tell you about our other friends over at rockauto.com. Oh, goodness. When you take your car out for a nice little spin here, you go ahead and you realize that maybe the tire pressure is not quite right, / your entire rear tire is completely flat. Good news is I literally, while we were doing this episode, was also able in the background to finish making the purchase that I needed to from rockauto.com. And I know that I saved myself a ton of money. You want proof? $223, $351, $646. That's the sensor. That's the hose. That's the monitor. They're in my cart. And I'm saving a ton of money on rockauto.com because they're a family-owned business serving do-it-yourselfers like you and me. You save time. You save money. You use rockauto.com. Easy to search drop-down menu. Find your make, find your model, find the year, find the part, and know you're getting a great price. You go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. You write Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Reliably low prices, amazing selection, all the parts your car will ever need, rockauto.com. So before we do, I will just say on Draymond Green, the very interesting thing that if you gave, at this point now, having won some championships, if you gave Seth Curry some truth serum, and because it's not like Draymond Green's making an insignificant amount of money, and you said, where else would you like to spend that, Curry, like over the next couple of seasons to improve this team? Now they're in the finals, so maybe it's all relative, but this ties into the Brooklyn Nets from one standpoint. I think Draymond Green is doing whatever possible to maintain himself at the highest possible level for his NBA career. And this is what it comes down to. I'm going to swing my legs around. Maybe I'll hit some guys in the crotch, whatever it takes. Seth Curry, on the other hand.
You mean Steph Curry? You said
Steph Curry and Seth Curry. I'm sure Seth Curry
could be Seth
same
too.
Thing. Could be
maybe
Seth.
We don't know. Like a family. It could be a family party. I don't know.
Yeah, could be Dell. We're not sure. Yeah. But the bottom line is with Steph Curry, he has evolved his body physically over the course of his career. You know, he went from being a total zero defensively to being able to physically be able to irritate, hold up, bother, and serve his role on that end of the court. He very much is, as much as any superstar, a two-way player in that regard, to whatever level of effectiveness. And the first thing when we look over at the Brooklyn Nets is, I just had this quick thought that came to mind around, is there a responsibility on the level of a Kevin Durant or a Kyrie Irving to evolve themselves physically over the course of their careers? And I know that if Curry hadn't done it, he wouldn't be in the position he is. So it was probably a necessity to evolve his game in that regard, to be more than an incredibly elite three-point shooter. But Kyrie Irving looks generally the same way that he's always been in his entire NBA career. We know that Kevin Durant has always been a very slim player. Did that series, especially for Kevin Durant, did you look at it against Boston and go, hey, listen, if you had a little more muscle on you, you might be able to Tatum it for a couple of possessions here and there when required?
No, I never really think that because one, I mean, Durant's an excellent defender, so I'm not worried about that. And I think Kyrie actually, for being slight of stature, is still plenty active. Like with guys like that, I just want them to be active at that point. And their offensive games are so great that it's going to almost always make up for whatever they lack in the defensive end. And again, Durant is just a good defender, so I'm not worried about that. I think what this series, what these things go to show you is that with the Nets, like as they go into this offseason, one, I don't think we need to be too concerned. It's actually like the superstars that I'm the least concerned about. It's that it's at times, especially like last year, they just haven't maximized the roster to fill out what they need to do around them. And I think that ends up becoming the biggest problem. You have sort of generational offensive talents, right? Like you need to fill in the roster around them. And it doesn't have to be exactly this, cookie cutter way of, all 3 and D wings, or like that's all they can do and then go 5 out. Like, I don't think the Nets need to do that, but they just need to do a little bit more optimization around what they have. And maybe some of that's going to be an X's and O strategy thing that they need to get better at. I think that's pretty clear that needs to be the case. But it's mostly like remove all the warts from like a personality standpoint or whatever. If you just take these guys as face value when it comes to their basketball standpoint, like the Nets already are most of the way there. It's just that they haven't been able to optimize the other parts. They came very close. If you look back, and actually the Nets already have an example like this on their books. Remember when James Harden came in and everyone was like, oh, you're going to play Harden, Kyrie, and KD together? Like who's going to shoot the ball? Like, who's going to be able to dribble the ball? There was all this, hand wringing about this isn't going to work. Hey, guess what? They killed everybody when they played together.
Too much talent. No.
Yeah, right. It's like, it's like who's not going to want the ball? They killed everybody in their minutes. Like and now they didn't get to do it that often because there was just all this other problems, but they had a 123 offensive rating in the 235 minutes they played together. They were plus, I just had it in front of me and I clicked off it. Yeah, they were +9, right, in terms of net rating. That was not how teams had traditionally been built, right? Like that was not the traditional way. And the only reason that is just all you have to do is go back to what people said at the time was like, this isn't going to work. They're going to be arguing all the ball. No, it just turned out they all just got great shots.
Like, you know what? All right. So that's actually really interesting because on the one hand, I was going to start to saying, I want to look at some of the roster pieces here for Brooklyn around Kyrie and Kevin Durant and Ben Simmons. If we just assume health, I think that's the way you have to approach these discussions.
For sure.
But a part of it was going to be, did the Nets miss the curve on this, right? That, hey, the NBA is shifting in the way things can get done. And maybe they push their chips all in on that superstar version. But to your point, this isn't Miami Heat where you had 3 very specific skill sets that complemented one another. This was a new version. It was a superstar version, but it would have been a uniquely new version of saying, we're going to bring together 3 guys that by consensus, a lot of outside minds think you're just not going to be able to manage that many people that need to have the ball in their hands. And it just seemingly worked itself out. Very small sample size. And then it kind of falls apart for all kinds of
it would have worked.
Non-basketball related reasons, right? Like it was going to work out. The health and everything else, they would have gotten there over the Milwaukee Bucks. The toe on the line. It wouldn't have even been a 7-game series if you had probably everybody healthy in that one. So that's interesting because it then does make you think when you look at this roster, maybe some of the pieces are already in place here. The last episode I talked a little bit about, are there these ideas of who could you use, maybe tradable assets? I think this conversation makes me say that guys like, I'm staying away from the superstar talent, but I'd mentioned Cam Thomas or a Joe Harris. I think that they can either be looked at more valuably because you don't have to worry. Okay, Joe Harris doesn't play great defense. He's a little stiff. He can't create for himself on the ball. Okay, there's versions where that's totally fine. He can just be the spot up shooter. I also think it can be okay to find a way to reshape and bring in other pieces, letting go of a talent like that objectively you may say, oh, but the 3-point percentage, you need that around the superstars. Maybe you don't. It makes me feel even stronger about Bruce Brown, who you talked about in the stats a couple episodes ago. And, knowing that he may not be the perfect version of a 2 guard or a pseudo 5 or whatever he is. And it makes me more bullish on what I had said about, I don't want Andre Drummond on this team anymore because I don't think you need that big body to rebound. I think there's other versions of it. What is your takeaway when you look at like the current Nets roster now? And do you agree on at least on the Drummond piece? Because I kind of put my convictions on that one. Like I'm out on Drummond because I don't think that this team needs that version of that player to have success.
Okay, so I'm at a crossroads here with
Unpack all those things I just said.
No, because I'm at a crossroads and I have 2 sort of like conflicting, there's somewhat competing ideas here. So on the one hand, I become a little less worried because I think that like on a core level, the Nets have the requisite amount of talent at the top of the roster, right? If Simmons comes back healthy, you have a connecting piece that kind of does solve. At some point, you just need, some more size, and you do need some things. Like you can't have 5 Kyrie Irvings go out on the court and win. It's just not going to work, right? You need some combinations of this stuff. So I think on a talent level, I started thinking, okay, even more like, hey, maybe guys like Claxton and Simmons can play together if there's creativity there, right? Like maybe these other guys are going to be so good on offense that with one more shooter, 3 elite scorers, or elite shooters combined with 2 non-shooters who are elite at defense. This is the other reason I was thinking about the Draymond Looney thing. I was like, the Nets have some weird version where it's not
the Simmons Claxton version.
That's what I mean. Yes. Yep. Okay. So that's the
I
good
love
news.
That now.
I think, yeah, right. Well, that was like where that thought process started going. I was like, hey, the Nets they're not exactly the same, but they do have lots of very similar-ish things, right? They can switch, they can get around the rim. Simmons is a better ball handler, and he's a great passer. But Draymond's maybe just like better all around the fence. Whatever you want to do, however you want to mix and match it, it's like not so dissimilar. Where I do get worried about the Nets is I do think that they have lacked at times the creativity to put the pieces together in the best way with like an X's and O's mentality and fundamental piece that like allows them to thrive. I think the Boston series was a good example. There didn't look to be, for having 2 great offensive players, it didn't look like they were running that much of an offense, right? Like it did not look like they were working to maximize the things that they did even have at the time. And I think,
and for as good as the Warriors are and as talented as Curry is or Klay Thompson, I know the different version of them, but Curry looks like he is one member of a system, right? He does not look elevated above any other component of what they do under Steve Kerr.
And I think that we would agree that the Warriors and Celtics, for what they do, there is a core X's and O's philosophy behind a lot of their strategies. And I think that has allowed them to make their whole the greater than the sum of their parts, because they know they have at their core being, they know exactly what they want to do because they believe that these systems they run, which are different, are going to work. I don't think that right now the Nets have that. And I think that is, if you want to say that's a Nash thing, if it's a coaching standpoint, there's been too much turnover in the coaching ranks. If maybe this just aren't the guys, this is not the group. Maybe they tried and can't get through. I don't know, whatever. Sometimes it's very hard to dissect what the exact issue is, if there is one at all with coaching. I would say, based on what we've seen at times, that I don't have the same confidence in that part of the game as much as I do in having some of the talent. And that's where I would worry that they would always maybe be a little behind if things especially weren't of the standard orientation, right? Like if they weren't, if they had to be a little different than your standard protocols when it came to basketball stuff. I don't know if we have enough examples of the Nets doing the most with the least when it comes to like their schemes. And so I want it to happen, but if I have a worry, I think that's it. Do you agree with that? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah. There's an irony around having that Kevin Durant had played with this Warriors team. So I think that there's probably a willingness there from him. And to your point, maybe it's just that the sample size was never big enough. Even when it was succeeding, when Harden was there, it still was never a big enough sample size to, if there were going to be X's and O's adjustments, that everyone was going to fully buy into it, or just not default to what feels like the natural state of, we need a bucket, I'll go get it for us, strategy be damned. And I think it would make sense for a lot of these guys to fall into that pattern. So now the question becomes, interesting enough, obviously Ben Simmons solves a lot of the needs that you may say that this team has in certain areas. Maybe a lot of the success of this model is going to be predicated on, does Ben Simmons buy into the version of what he is, what he needs to do for this team to be successful? If it starts with him, then I think the byproduct, as we saw from Kevin Durant, he's comfortable deferring. And Kyrie wants to be able to go get his and then also take the step back. So if the other parts around them are in place and can be successful, well, all of a sudden it's the Reggie Jackson line, right? The straw that stirs the drink. Like, somebody has to be the glue, I think, between the superstar 2 players you have at the top and then all the others. And right now, it sounds interesting. We can dive in this deeper as we move along the summer. It's like Ben Simmons might be that guy that needs to do that role in order for Steve Nash and this team to have success.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. Like, I think there's I think we'll kind of know some more stuff as the finals shake out here too. I don't think from this point of view, like however these finals shake out, I don't think my opinion on this is going to change too much. Like, I don't think these
it's the new world order in the NBA.
Yeah, I don't think these final couple games,
any different way you want to do it, you can be successful.
When we're 1-1 in the finals, we're as close to the finish line as saying like these 2 things worked. I don't know what else to tell you. So I don't think the outcome here is going to change my mind too much, but I do think I'm curious now to see, now that we understand that these different models can work, like what the Nets think that their model is. I think that is, and I think that's like, I don't think we've seen a lot of signs yet that they know what that is. And we're going to have a new group of personnel almost for sure. Like, that's going to come around this year. that will help define it. So anyway, well, yeah, we'll keep this discussion going throughout the offseason. I'm curious to hear what everyone else thinks about this. Like, if you think we're on point with something here, if we're off base, I think we're kind of leaning into an idea here that's going to maybe be something, a thread that we can track throughout the offseason and into the season too. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe over wherever you listen to podcasts, free and available on all platforms. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube as well. All that stuff is super free, but it really, really helps us a lot coming at you every single day. So subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and subscribe on YouTube as well.
Think about this one, friends. If you try to fail and succeed, which have you done? George Carlin.
Oh, RIP, one of the legends. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.